Tonight, let the ocean pull you deeper than light reaches. Less than 20% of it has ever been explored, and what lives in the darkness below that threshold doesn't follow the rules of anything at the surface. This video descends zone by zone, from shallow coastal water to the floor of the Mariana Trench, and the creatures get harder to explain the further down we go. Most people picture the ocean as a vast surface of water with some creatures swimming through it, coral reefs near the top, open blue in the middle, and a flat, muddy bottom somewhere far below. That picture is wrong in almost every detail. The ocean is not one environment. It's a stack of completely separate worlds, each one darker, colder, and more pressurized than the one above it. And the conditions change so drastically between zones that an animal built for one would die almost immediately in another. Humans have been sailing on the ocean's surface for thousands of years. Mapping the moon's surface took decades of investment and came back with more detail than most of the ocean floor currently has. The seafloor is harder to reach and more expensive to study than the surface of another planet, and it shows in the data. What we understand about the deep ocean comes from a fraction of the expeditions it would take to survey it properly, most of them concentrated in the same few locations that are logistically accessible. What sits below the surface is not empty. Every zone has its own set of organisms, each one containing life that has no equivalent anywhere above it. The descent starts at 200 meters, where sunlight stops reaching. Below that, the zones follow by depth, each defined by what the one above it no longer has, until the floor of the Mariana Trench. But the scale of what we don't know isn't just a gap in a database somewhere. It has direct consequences for how we interpret the biology we think we understand. Every model of ocean ecosystem function, how carbon cycles through the water column, how heat distributes across the deep, how species interact across depth zones, is built on data from less than a fifth of the total system. The assumptions embedded in those models extend across the portion of the system nobody has data from. The conclusions might be right. They also might be describing a fraction of a much larger picture and mistaking it for the whole thing. But the problem goes beyond incomplete data. The deep ocean is not static. Currents shift. Temperature gradients change. Species that were documented at one depth in one decade turn up at different depths in the next, and researchers can't always tell whether the animal moved or whether the earlier data was just wrong. What we think we know about the ocean is a snapshot taken at very few points, extrapolated across an environment that covers most of the planet and extends kilometers below the surface. But here's the part that compounds everything else. The creatures are already there, documented or not, named or not. They are feeding, reproducing, and dying in water that no instrument has passed through. The ocean doesn't hold still while we catch up. Whatever is down there is already operating, and most of it is operating in the 80% nobody has looked at. The number that matters most isn't 71%, it's 20. 20% of the ocean has been mapped with any meaningful resolution, and the mapping that does exist reveals something worth sitting with. The seafloor is not a flat, featureless plain. It contains mountain ranges taller than the Himalayas, trenches deep enough to swallow Everest with 2 kilometers to spare, and cave systems that stretch for hundreds of kilometers through the dark. What we've found in that 20% already includes creatures that dissolve bone with acid roots, sharks that were alive before the Industrial Revolution, and organisms that aren't technically single animals at all. That's the explored fraction. The remaining 80% sits under pressures that destroy most of the equipment we send into it at temperatures near freezing, in total and permanent darkness. The cost of a single deep-sea research expedition runs into the millions of dollars, and most institutions don't have the budget to mount them regularly. What that means practically is that the ocean floor, a surface area larger than all of Earth's forests, deserts, and mountains combined, remains, in almost all of it, completely unknown. Not unexplored in the way that a hiking trail is unexplored before you walk it. Unknown in the sense that no human instrument has ever passed through it. At each depth in this descent, the picture changes in ways that are hard to anticipate. The creatures in the shallows are strange. The ones in the middle depths are stranger. What survives at the very bottom operates on principles that have almost nothing in common with the biology most people learned in school. If you're watching this and something's already stuck, drop it below. The creatures from here down are stranger than anything covered so far. The first creature on this descent doesn't live in the dark. It lives in shallow water, in the places people actually wade through on vacation. And it has killed people who never saw it coming. What makes it dangerous isn't venom alone. It's that the fish itself is completely invisible. It requires no movement to cause injury, and it can be just as lethal completely out of the water. The stonefish is where this starts. The epipelagic zone, the top 200 meters of ocean, is the part people actually interact with. It's where swimmers go, where snorkelers explore reef flats, where tourists wade through shallow coastal water in places like Australia, the Indo-Pacific, and the Red Sea. The water is warm and clear enough to see through. The sea floor in these areas looks like sand, rubble, and rock scattered across the bottom of lagoons and reef edges. The stonefish lives in this zone, not in the deep water, not in the darkness further down. At the surface, in the exact places where human traffic is highest. It is classified as a scorpionfish, part of the family Synansiidae, and it is the most venomous fish currently known to science. But nothing about the way it looks communicates that. No bright colors, no visible warning signals, no size that marks it as a threat. At rest, it is indistinguishable from the surrounding reef rubble, right down to the texture and color variation across its body. It settles into position on the seafloor, pulls sand or mud over the lower part of its body, and waits. The 13 spines along its dorsal fin sit just below the surface of the skin, each one hollow, each one connected to a venom gland at its base. The stonefish doesn't inject venom by biting or striking. Pressure from above does it. But the camouflage is only the first problem. The second is geography. The stonefish's range covers the Indo-Pacific broadly, Australia, the Philippines, the coast of East Africa, the Red Sea, parts of the Indian Ocean, which means the overlap between its habitat and high-density human coastal activity is significant and not shrinking. Beach tourism in the Indo-Pacific has grown steadily for decades. More people are wading into exactly the environments where the stonefish sits and waits, and most of them have never been told what one looks like. But even people who know it exists can't always identify it in the water. The stonefish's camouflage has been effective against predators for long enough that it fools the visual system of any animal looking at it, including humans who are specifically looking for it. Research divers with experience in stonefish habitat have reported stepping over them without realizing it. The fish doesn't flinch, it has no reason to. The venom glands are the response, not flight. But the 24-hour survival window outside water means the exposure does nothing to reduce what it carries. A stonefish on dry ground is not a neutralized stonefish. The venom glands remain pressurized, the spines remain upright, and the animal remains capable of delivering the same injury it would in water. The exposure that should signal safety doesn't change what the fish is. Danger doesn't require movement. Most animals that can kill you announce themselves in some way: size, speed, aggression, noise. The stonefish does the opposite. It removes every visible signal. It sits completely still in an environment where humans feel safe, in water shallow enough to stand in places that look like ordinary seafloor, and it waits for the environment itself to do the work. You don't need to approach it. You need to not see it, and that's nearly impossible. The venom is the part that makes it medically serious. Stonefish venom is a protein-based toxin that attacks cardiovascular and neuromuscular functions simultaneously. The pain response is documented as among the worst a human being can experience, severe enough that some victims have reportedly requested amputation of the affected limb to stop it. Hot water immersion, up to 90 minutes, degrades the protein structure of the toxin and provides relief. And anti-venom exists for the most severe systemic cases. But treatment depends entirely on reaching medical care, which depends on recognizing what caused the injury, which is the part most people get wrong. The injury looks like a puncture wound. The stonefish is already gone. Or more accurately, it never left. It's still in the same position, waiting for the next thing to land on it. The 24-hour air survival range is what makes it genuinely difficult to plan around. Coral reefs at low tide expose patches of rock and rubble that are easy to walk across. Some of those patches contain stonefish. No discoloration, no unusual texture, no warning. The stonefish doesn't need the ocean to be lethal. It just needs to be there. The stonefish is solitary, passive, and silent. The next animal in this zone is none of those things. It hunts in groups of hundreds, moves at speeds above 25 kilometers per hour, and has a communication system that researchers still haven't decoded. It also eats its own injured members without hesitation. Fishermen in the Eastern Pacific gave it a name, and the name came from watching what happens when a hunting school hits a fish shoal at night. Still in the epipelagic zone, but a different kind of animal entirely. The stonefish is stationary, solitary, and entirely passive until contact is made. The Humboldt squid is the opposite on every count. It lives in the Eastern Pacific, primarily in the Humboldt Current that runs along the western coast of South America, and it is one of the largest squid species in the world that doesn't qualify as a giant or colossal squid. It reaches up to 2 meters in length. It weighs up to 50 kilograms. The Humboldt squid doesn't spend much time near the surface in daylight. It drops to depths of around 200 to 700 meters during the day and rises towards the surface at night to feed, following the vertical migration of the fish it hunts. That pattern brings it into the upper ocean after dark, the same water where fishing vessels operate, where divers sometimes work at night, and where the ocean looks very different without sunlight. It has 8 arms lined with suckers, each sucker rimmed with sharp, tooth-like serrations that grip prey and resist release. The beak at the center of those arms can cut through fish bone. The chromatophores across its skin, the pigment cells that drive the color changes, respond within milliseconds to signals from the nervous system, producing the flashing patterns that are visible in the dark over distances. Commercial fishermen working the Eastern Pacific know these animals by a name they didn't arrive at casually, but the size and speed don't fully explain the threat. What makes the Humboldt squid unusual among large invertebrates is the group behavior, and the group behavior doesn't follow any pattern that maps cleanly onto what researchers expect from squid. Most cephalopods are solitary hunters. The Humboldt squid forms aggregations of hundreds or thousands that move and feed in a way that requires some form of coordination. But the coordination mechanism is not understood. The chromatophore flashing carries information, but what information, in what sequence, producing what behavioral response, remains an open question. Researchers are watching something that works and not yet knowing how. But the cannibalism piece changes the calculus in a specific way. An injured animal in most predator groups functions as a signal. It draws attention, triggers defensive responses, changes the group's behavior. In a Humboldt squid school, an injured animal triggers feeding. That means injuries inside the group don't slow the hunt, they add to it. A school that loses members during an active hunt doesn't lose momentum. It gains food, but the depth migration creates an additional problem for anyone trying to study them directly. During daylight hours, the Humboldt squid sits at depths where most diving equipment can't reach and where submersible observation time is limited and expensive. At night, it's at the surface, but at night, in open ocean water, observing a school of Humboldt squid actively feeding is not something most researchers can do safely. The animal is accessible exactly when conditions make it hardest to study, and the picture that emerges from those conditions is the one that gave it its name. The Humboldt squid is one of the few animals in the ocean that researchers describe as genuinely tactical in its hunting behavior. The coordination within a hunting school isn't random. Individual squid appear to communicate state and position through the chromatophore flashing, the rapid red-white strobing, during active hunts, though the exact encoding of that system is still being studied. What's observable is the outcome. Fish schools targeted by Humboldt squid are attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, with members of the school cut off and isolated before being consumed. The efficiency is high enough that researchers working in the Eastern Pacific have described the aftermath of a Humboldt squid hunt as a section of ocean that simply empties out. The cannibalism piece answers a question that comes up when you first hear about it. Why doesn't the injured squid get evacuated or protected? The answer is that Humboldt squid don't operate that way. A compromised individual in the water column is a food source, and the group treats it as one immediately. There's no delay, no hesitation. The group's feeding behavior doesn't distinguish between prey species and injured group members once a certain threshold of incapacity is crossed. That behavior makes the Humboldt squid efficient in a way that's different from most apex predators. It wastes nothing, including itself. The name Diablo Rojo came from commercial fishermen who worked the Eastern Pacific for decades and encountered these animals regularly. It wasn't given lightly. Fishermen who have watched a hunting school move through a fish shoal at night describe a specific sequence. The strobing starts, the water churns, and then everything in that section of ocean is gone. What was there a few minutes earlier simply isn't anymore. Below 200 meters, sunlight stops entirely. What lives in the darkness that follows doesn't fit cleanly into any category most people have for animals. The next organism on this descent holds the record for the longest animal ever documented on Earth. But whether it counts as one animal or thousands of separate ones simultaneously is a question biology still doesn't have clean language for. Below 200 meters, sunlight stops, not dims, stops. The last photons from the surface fail to penetrate beyond the epipelagic zone, and what begins at 200 meters is the mesopelagic zone, also called the twilight zone, though there is no light in it that a human eye would register. Temperature drops sharply. Pressure increases at a rate of roughly 1 atmosphere for every 10 meters of depth. By 500 meters, the pressure is 50 times what it is at the surface. The organisms that live here have had millions of years to solve problems that don't exist in shallower water. How to find food without light, how to avoid predators that can see bioluminescence, how to structure a body that functions under pressure. The solutions are unusual. Some are individual animals with extreme adaptations. Some are not individual animals at all. The siphonophore belongs to the second category. It is found throughout the mesopelagic zone and below, drifting with the currents that move through the mid-ocean. What exactly it is, what category of living thing it belongs to, is not obvious from any external observation. A gas-filled float sits at the top. Below it, filaments extend downward for tens of meters, trailing through the dark water with no visible boundary between where the organism starts and where it ends. But the category problem is not just a philosophical one. It affects how the siphonophore is studied, because the standard frameworks for measuring an animal, individual body mass, metabolic rate per organism, population count, don't apply cleanly to something that is simultaneously one thing and many thousands of things. A zooid extracted from the colony and examined in isolation gives you data about a zooid, not about the colony. The colony behaves differently from any of its parts. Most of what is known about siphonophore predation comes from remote observation, because any attempt to collect a specimen destroys the structure that makes it function. But the scale creates a different kind of problem in the water column. A siphonophore, trailing 30 or 40 meters of tentacles, occupies a vertical section of the ocean that most animals in that zone can't avoid entirely. The tentacles don't advertise themselves. They're essentially transparent, which means bioluminescent organisms that are already navigating carefully through the dark water can pass through undisturbed until they aren't. The colony doesn't pursue anything. It doesn't have to. But what the siphonophore's bioluminescent coordination actually does, whether the light produced by certain zooids functions as a lure, as a threat signal, as intra-colony communication, or some combination, is still not resolved. Different species produce light differently in different patterns at different points in the colony structure. The system is real, measurable, and complex. What it is for is still being worked out. An organism that has been in the ocean for hundreds of millions of years is still not fully understood in any of its basic functions. Each zooid in the colony is an individual organism with its own cellular structure and genetic identity. But no zooid can survive independently. A zooid pulled from the colony dies. The colony as a whole, though, functions, hunts, reproduces, and grows, sometimes to lengths exceeding 50 meters. The longest animal ever recorded on Earth is not a blue whale, it's a siphonophore, an organism that didn't exist as a concept in most people's understanding of what animals can be. The predation mechanism is the part that matches the scale. The tentacles that trail below a mature siphonophore colony contain millions of nematocysts, stinging cells, each capable of firing a hollow thread into prey and delivering a paralytic toxin. A single contact is enough to immobilize small fish or crustaceans. A large colony, trailing 20 or 30 meters of tentacles, creates an enormous passive trap. It doesn't chase anything. It drifts through the twilight zone, and the prey comes to it, touches the tentacles, and that's the end of that. The bioluminescence adds one more layer. Some Zoids within the colony produce light, and the coordination of that light production with other colony functions, movement, feeding, threat response, is still being mapped. What the siphonophore represents is a model of life that evolution arrived at independently of everything else. A collective organism that acts as one and is genuinely many. Hunting at a scale that almost nothing else in the ocean can match, in complete darkness, without a brain. Still in the twilight zone, and the next predator here is one of the smallest on this list. It measures under 25 centimeters and carries none of the physical markers that usually predict an effective predator. What it has instead is a set of adaptations that each target a specific gap in its prey's ability to detect it. And the system works precisely because none of those adaptations are visible until the hunt is already over. Still in the mesopelagic zone, where the darkness is total and the pressure at the lower edge reaches 100 atmospheres. Most predators here have adapted around bioluminescence, either producing it to attract prey, detecting it to avoid predators, or both. That arms race between light production and light detection has been running for a very long time, and it has produced some of the most precisely engineered hunting systems found anywhere in the animal kingdom. The dragonfish sits somewhere in the middle of the water column, between 200 and 1,000 meters, depending on the time of day and the availability of prey. It is not large. A fully grown dragonfish measures between 15 and 25 centimeters. At that size, it is smaller than a great many of the fish it preys on. And its body carries none of the physical markers that usually correlate with effective predation. No thick muscle mass, no speed adaptations in the tail structure, no armor. What it has instead is a set of adaptations that make its size irrelevant, features that are individually unusual and collectively precise. Each one targets a specific gap in its prey's ability to detect or respond, and the system only becomes clear once the predation sequence is complete. But the pressure of detection cuts both ways. The mesopelagic zone is an environment where any biological signal, movement, light, heat, electrical field is a potential target. Predators at this depth have had millions of years to develop sensitivity to exactly those signals, because finding prey in total darkness requires detecting something the prey gives off. The dragonfish is small enough that its own movement produces a detectable pressure wave. Its body temperature is close to ambient, which offers little thermal contrast, and it needs to get close, very close, before any of its hunting mechanisms can operate. An animal that hunts by eliminating its prey's ability to detect it still has to close the distance without being detected first. But the prey in this zone are not passive. The organisms the dragonfish targets have their own adaptations, lateral line systems tuned to water displacement, bioluminescent threat responses, rapid directional acceleration built for escape. Some have evolved sensitivity to pressure changes, produced by approaching bodies at distances of several body lengths. The dragonfish's hunting system is precise, but precision only matters if the dragonfish can get within range. Every meter of approach is a meter during which the prey's detection systems are still active and responding. But the dragonfish also produces bioluminescent light, which is the detail that cuts against it most directly. Any light output in the mesopelagic zone is a signal that other predators can follow. The dragonfish hunts with light in an environment full of animals that have evolved to find light in the dark. While it is using light to locate prey, that same light is advertising its position to everything else in the water column that can see it. The dragonfish operates inside a detection arms race from both directions simultaneously, hunting prey that can sense it coming, while being visible to predators that can see what it's doing. A 20-centimeter fish hunting prey up to half its own body size in complete darkness at depths between 200 and 1,000 meters, with no obvious physical advantage, no bulk, no speed record. No armor should be a poor predator by any standard measure. The 3 adaptations it carries instead make size irrelevant. Transparent teeth are not common in nature. The reason they matter is that in dark water, even faint bioluminescence can catch on a surface and create a visible glint. Prey animals in the mesopelagic zone have evolved sensitivity to exactly this kind of light scatter over millions of years. Detecting the edge of an approaching jaw before contact is a survival response. The dragonfish removed that possibility. Its teeth are functionally invisible in water. The jaw itself can swing past 100 degrees, wider than any hinge on a fish its size has any reason to achieve. But the reason is straightforward. Prey that touches the teeth is already inside the jaw radius before it can react. The red light filament is the piece that closes the system. Most organisms at this depth are blind to red wavelengths. Their photoreceptors evolved for blue and green light, the wavelengths that penetrate deepest from the surface. Red light, at 700 nanometers, falls outside their detection range. The dragonfish hunts in what its prey perceive as total darkness, tracks them with a light they cannot see, and closes with teeth they cannot detect. Every component of that system targets a specific gap in the prey's ability to respond, and each gap is real, confirmed, and not going away. Deeper now. At 1,000 meters, the twilight zone ends and the bathyal zone begins. Cold, dark, and almost completely unstudied. The shark that lives here has been on Earth for 125 million years, survived every mass extinction since, and belongs to a lineage where every other member is extinct. Its jaw doesn't open. It launches, and the mechanism behind that has been filmed only a handful of times in recorded history. At 1,000 meters, the mesopelagic zone ends and the bathyal zone begins. Pressure here exceeds 100 atmospheres. Temperature stabilizes near 4 degrees Celsius and stays there. No sunlight, no seasonal variation, no surface-driven weather patterns, just cold, dark, still water extending from 1,000 meters down to 4,000. The animals in this zone are among the least observed on Earth. Most of what researchers know about them comes from specimens brought up incidentally by deepwater fishing gear, or from the small number of remotely operated vehicles that have reached these depths with working cameras. The goblin shark has been known to science since 1898, when a specimen was caught off the coast of Japan. It belongs to the family Mitsukuridae, and every other member of that family is extinct, known only from fossilized teeth and jaw fragments found in geological layers dating back to the Cretaceous period. The goblin shark is the last one. Its lineage extends back 125 million years, which predates the emergence of most modern shark families by tens of millions of years. Its appearance is distinctive enough that it has never been mistaken for another species. The snout extends forward well beyond the jawline, flat on top and tapered toward the front, and packed along its underside with sensory pores. The skin has a pinkish tone unusual for a deep water shark, and the jaw sits in a retracted position under the snout when the shark is at rest, giving its face a profile that looks structurally misaligned, as if the jaw belongs to a different animal. But the jaw protrusion creates a problem for understanding the goblin shark's hunting range that hasn't been resolved. The electroreceptors in the snout can detect electrical fields at very close range, the fields produced by muscle contractions in nearby fish, the weak bioelectric signatures that all living tissue generates. That detection range is short, measured in centimeters to perhaps a meter in optimal conditions. But the jaw can extend significantly beyond the body of the shark before the teeth make contact. The question of how close the goblin shark actually needs to be before it initiates the protrusion sequence, and how consistently it can calibrate that distance in total darkness, is not something researchers can currently answer with any precision. But the rarity of observation has a downstream effect that compounds over time. Most of what is known about goblin shark diet comes from stomach contents of the few specimens that have been brought to the surface. And those specimens are not representative of the population. They are the ones that ended up in fishing gear in places where fishing gear operates, at depths fishing gear reaches. The goblin shark's actual depth range and the full extent of what it preys on is inferred from an unrepresentative sample collected under conditions that select against the deepest, most elusive individuals. But the pressure deterioration problem is the one that closes off most remaining research options. A goblin shark brought to the surface alive doesn't stay alive long enough to study in any controlled way. The physiological systems adapted for bathyal pressure begin to fail at surface conditions, which means no live specimens in research facilities, no behavioral observation outside the animal's natural environment, and no opportunity to test the jaw protrusion mechanism except in the rare footage that already exists. A species that has been on Earth for 125 million years has been accessible to formal scientific study for just over a century, and most of that study has been conducted on dead animals that were never meant to be caught. The goblin shark has been on the planet for 125 million years, and in that time, the ocean has changed almost completely around it. Continents moved, sea levels rose and fell by hundreds of meters. Entire taxonomic groups of marine animals appeared and then went extinct. The goblin shark kept working. That kind of continuity is rare enough to be worth examining. It means the goblin shark solved its survival problem a very long time ago and hasn't needed to revisit the solution since. The jaw protrusion is the adaptation most researchers point to when explaining why. The mechanism is called slingshot feeding. The jaw and associated cartilage are stored in a compressed position, and when prey is detected, they launch forward at high speed, extending the jaw well beyond the profile of the face before the teeth make contact. The goblin shark can detect prey and strike before conventional biting distance is reached. It detects prey with the electroreceptors in its flat snout, and by the time the prey has registered the shark as a threat, the jaw is already there. The speed of jaw protrusion has been measured at around 3.14 meters per second, which is fast enough that prey reaction time is essentially irrelevant. What it looks like is something that shouldn't be possible in a fish. The jaw leaves the face, collects the prey, and retracts, all within a fraction of a second. It's been filmed only a small number of times because the goblin shark lives at depths that make observation difficult and is encountered rarely enough that most marine biologists have never seen one in the wild. The sightings that do exist come primarily from deep water fishing operations that brought them up as bycatch. Even then, goblin sharks deteriorate quickly out of pressure, which makes study difficult. A predator that has hunted successfully for over 100 million years remains, for the most part, poorly understood. Still in the bathyal zone, and the next animal here, lives longer than any other vertebrate on record, but confirming that required a method most people wouldn't expect. Current estimates place its lifespan between 200 and 500 years. It reaches sexual maturity at around 150. It moves at 1.2 kilometers per hour. Most individuals alive right now have never reproduced, and a parasite that lives on its cornea has left the majority of the population partially or fully blind, which hasn't stopped it from feeding on seals, polar bears, and anything else it can locate in the dark. Still, in the bathyal zone, in the cold water of the North Atlantic and Arctic Ocean, the Greenland shark is found across a wide geographic range, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Norwegian Sea. But its preference is for cold, deep water, and it is most commonly recorded at depths between 200 and 2,200 meters. It is one of the largest predatory sharks in the world, reaching lengths of up to 7 meters and weights exceeding a metric ton in the largest documented individuals. It does not behave like a large predatory shark is expected to behave. The great white shark, which is smaller on average, patrols actively, can accelerate to bursts of 40 kilometers per hour, and hunts by intercepting prey from below at speed. The Greenland shark moves at around 1.2 kilometers per hour, a pace that most humans can walk faster than, and shows no burst speed capability in any recorded observation. Its musculature is built for sustained slow movement, not acceleration. Its diet includes fish, seals, moose, reindeer, horses, and polar bears, most of these found in stomach contents rather than direct observation, which means the Greenland shark is acquiring large, fast prey through methods that are still not fully understood. Scavenging on carcasses accounts for some of it. Ambush predation on sleeping seals is the most accepted explanation for the rest. But the lifespan creates a problem that goes beyond biology. An animal that lives for potentially 500 years accumulates environmental exposure across a time frame that no research program can follow directly. The oldest confirmed Greenland sharks were born before most of the industrialized world's chemical outputs existed, before persistent organic pollutants, before widespread heavy metal contamination of Arctic water, before the plastics that are now found at every depth of the ocean. What those centuries of exposure have deposited in the tissues of currently living Greenland sharks is not something that has been systematically measured. The oldest ones are, in terms of accumulated contamination, largely unknown. But the reproductive timeline has a population-level consequence that no amount of individual longevity can offset. When a species takes 150 years to reach sexual maturity and produces relatively few offspring per reproductive cycle, the population's recovery from any sustained mortality pressure is measured not in years or decades, but in centuries. The individual animal outlasts almost everything around it. The population, if pushed, recovers on a timescale that outlasts the institutions studying it. But the parasitic blindness is the detail that recalibrates the entire picture in an unexpected direction. Omatacoita elongata, the copepod that attaches to the corneal tissue, is found on the eyes of the majority of Greenland sharks that have been examined. Partial or total visual loss in the affected eye is the consistent result. In an animal that hunts in environments with no available light, this would appear to be a manageable deficit. And for the Greenland shark, it apparently is, because the diet analysis says the shark is still catching seals. But the question of what the shark is missing, what it fails to detect or respond to because of that sensory loss, is not one that stomach contents can answer. The Greenland shark's lifespan was confirmed not by observation, but by carbon dating the crystalline lens of its eye, a structure that forms before birth and does not regenerate or replace its cells over time. Radiocarbon analysis of lens proteins places the oldest confirmed Greenland shark at approximately 392 years, with a margin that extends the estimate toward 500. That means the animal was alive before the founding of the United States, before the Industrial Revolution, before modern medicine existed in any recognizable form. It was feeding in cold northern water while major historical events that now fill textbooks were still happening. Sexual maturity at 150 years has a specific biological consequence worth understanding. Most Greenland sharks alive in the ocean right now have not yet reproduced. The population turns over extremely slowly. A species with that reproductive timeline is inherently vulnerable to pressures that kill individuals before they reach maturity. Commercial fishing operations that bring them up unintentionally, for instance, because each death removes not just an animal, but a century and a half of developmental investment that never produced offspring. The parasitic copod on the eye, Omatocoeta elongata, feeds on the corneal tissue and causes significant visual degradation. The shark loses effective vision in the affected eye over time. In an animal that hunts in total darkness anyway, this matters less than it might in a surface predator, and the Greenland shark compensates through olfaction and lateral line sensing. What it ends up being is a half-blind, slow-moving, centuries-old predator that still manages to feed on seals, fish, and whatever else it can locate in cold, deep water. It is not fast. It doesn't need to be. Time is the one resource it has in surplus. Deeper still, at 4,000 meters the abyssal zone begins, and the food supply here arrives almost entirely from above. Dead animals sinking through kilometers of water before settling on the floor. The organism that waits for it looks like the roly-poly bug from a garden, scaled up to 45 centimeters, with 4 sets of jaws and a body plan that has been running without revision since the Jurassic. It can go without eating for over 4 years. When something does arrive, it doesn't waste any of it. The abyssal zone begins at around 4,000 meters and extends to 6,000. Pressure here exceeds 600 atmospheres. The floor is mostly sediment, a fine layer of particles that have drifted down from the water column above over millions of years, accumulating at a rate of about a centimeter per 1,000 years. Nothing photosynthesizes here. Nothing produces energy from sunlight because no sunlight reaches this far down. The energy that sustains this ecosystem arrives from above, in the form of organic material falling from shallower water, dead animals, fecal matter, biological debris of every description, slowly descending through thousands of meters of water before settling on the floor. The animals that live here are built around that food supply. They wait, they scavenge, and they make the most of whatever reaches the bottom. Most of them are small. The exceptions are what make the abyssal zone genuinely strange. Deep-sea gigantism is the term for a pattern that appears repeatedly at significant depth. Organisms that have close relatives in shallow water, but grow to sizes in the deep that would be biologically impossible near the surface. The giant isopod is the most familiar example of that pattern, partly because it looks like something people recognize. The roly-poly, the small armored bug found in garden soil, is its shallow water relative. The giant isopod shares the same basic body plan: the segmented, armored exoskeleton, the ability to curl into a ball when threatened, the 7 pairs of legs. At the surface, that body plan produces an animal roughly the size of a fingernail, At abyssal depths, it produces something 45 centimeters long, with 4 sets of jaw structures and a weight of nearly 2 kilograms. But deep-sea gigantism doesn't produce consistent results across species, which is part of what makes it difficult to pin down mechanistically. Some organisms at abyssal depths are giant. Others, in the same zone, at the same pressure and temperature, with access to the same food supply, remain small. The isopod grew to 45 centimeters. The bacteria that process organic material on the same seafloor did not scale up. The pattern appears selectively, which means the explanation has to account not just for why some things get large, but why the same environmental conditions don't produce gigantism uniformly. That question doesn't currently have a clean answer. But the feast or famine feeding pattern introduces a constraint that size makes worse, not better. A larger body requires more energy to maintain, more tissue to repair, more cellular activity to sustain, a higher baseline metabolic cost even at the reduced rate that cold temperature produces. Going without food for 4 years is more physiologically demanding for a 2-kilogram animal than for a 2-gram one, even accounting for the slower metabolism at depth. The isopod manages it, apparently through energy storage mechanisms that researchers are still working to fully characterize, but the margin for error is narrow. A prolonged absence of organic material sinking from the water column above doesn't mean the isopod can simply wait indefinitely. But the 160 million year body plan presents a question that cuts in 2 directions simultaneously. An unchanged design across that span either means the deep ocean environment has stayed stable enough to make revision unnecessary, or it means the isopod's design is so broadly capable that it hasn't needed revision regardless of what changed around it. Researchers don't currently have a way to distinguish between those 2 explanations, and the distinction matters. One describes an animal perfectly suited to a stable world. The other describes an animal that may be suited to almost anything, or may not be suited to the specific changes now arriving at the abyssal floor. The giant isopod size is the first thing, but the biology behind it is the more interesting part. Deep-sea gigantism. The pattern where organisms at significant depth grow far larger than their shallow water relatives has been observed across multiple taxonomic groups, but the mechanism behind it isn't fully resolved. The leading explanations involve cold temperature slowing metabolism and extending growth phases, reduced predation pressure at depth allowing individuals to survive long enough to reach exceptional size, and the potential role of oxygen concentration in deep water. None of these fully accounts for the pattern on its own, and the isopod is a case study in how much is still unknown about deep-sea biology. What is known is the behavior. The giant isopod can go without food for years. Specimens in captivity have been documented surviving over 4 years without eating. When food does arrive, a whale carcass sinking to the seafloor, a large fish falling from the water column above, the isopod eats aggressively and in large quantities, apparently storing energy across its body tissues for the gaps between meals. The 4 sets of jaw structures work independently and in coordination, allowing it to process hard-shelled prey, soft tissue, and bone. Anything organic that reaches the seafloor is within its range. The 160 million year lineage places the giant isopod's ancestors in the Jurassic period, at a time when the supercontinent Pangaea was still breaking apart and the Atlantic Ocean didn't yet exist in its current form. The isopod's body plan, the 14 legs, the armored exoskeleton, the compound eyes, has remained essentially unchanged across that entire span. Every extinction event, every shift in ocean chemistry, every reorganization of the planet's geology passed through that period and left the isopod's design intact. The environment changed repeatedly and completely. The isopod didn't. Below 6,000 meters, the ocean enters the Hadal Zone, the trenches. For most of the 20th century, the scientific consensus held that vertebrate life couldn't survive at these pressures. Then cameras reached those depths and filmed something moving. The deepest fish ever recorded lives at over 8,300 meters, where pressure is more than 800 times what exists at the surface. Its body is built entirely around not being rigid. And it wasn't just surviving down there, it was feeding. Below 6,000 meters, the ocean enters the Hadal Zone, named after Hades, the Greek underworld. This zone exists almost exclusively inside trenches. Long, narrow cuts in the seafloor produced by tectonic plate subduction, where one plate slides beneath another and carves a depression in the seafloor that can extend 11,000 meters below sea level. The Mariana Trench in the Western Pacific is the deepest of these, reaching 10,935 meters at Challenger Deep. At 8,000 meters, the pressure is 800 times that of the surface atmosphere. Temperature hovers near freezing. There is no food production, no light, no seasonal change, and no access to the surface food chain except through what filters down, through 8 kilometers of water. For most of the 20th century, the scientific consensus held that vertebrate life, animals with spines, with complex organ systems, with the kind of physiology that requires stable protein chemistry and cell membrane integrity, could not function under those conditions. The pressure alone was thought to be incompatible with the biochemistry that vertebrates depend on. That consensus held until cameras reached those depths and filmed something moving. The snailfish, genus Pseudoleparis, had been known to exist at significant depth before that footage was recorded, but the depths at which it was later documented pushed past every previous estimate of what was survivable. When the footage came back, it was not a small revision to the existing model. It was a clean break from what the field had assumed. But the pressure adaptation that keeps the snailfish functional at 8,300 meters creates a hard boundary in the other direction. The same cellular chemistry calibrated for compression at that depth becomes misaligned as pressure decreases toward the surface. The snailfish cannot survive decompression the way surface fish tolerate pressure increases. Its biology is tuned to an environment that cannot be replicated outside it, which means no live specimen has ever been studied in a controlled setting. Everything known about how it functions at depth comes from footage, from deceased specimens brought up in collection equipment, and from the biochemical analysis of tissue samples that were never alive at surface pressure. But the questions that footage can't answer are the ones that matter most. At 8,300 meters, the snailfish moves, competes for food, and appears to function without obvious threat from any other vertebrate in the same zone. What selection pressures shaped the behavior patterns visible in that footage? How the snailfish finds food, how it responds to other individuals of its own species, what drives the movement patterns observed around the bait can't be read from a camera positioned outside the animal. The footage shows what the snailfish does. It doesn't show why, and in an environment this isolated, the why is not something researchers can assume from surface analogies. But the food source dependency creates a structural vulnerability that the snailfish can't resolve through adaptation. The small crustaceans and amphipods it feeds on are themselves dependent on organic material filtering down from the surface, thousands of meters above. Any disruption to that vertical supply chain, changes in surface productivity, shifts in the composition of what sinks, propagates all the way to the trench floor. The snailfish sits at the bottom of an ecosystem that starts at the surface, and it has no access to any other food supply. What happens at the surface of the ocean and what sinks from it determines what the snailfish has to eat. The deepest fish on Earth is directly dependent on conditions it can't reach and can't influence. The snailfish settled a question that had been open for decades: whether the deepest zones of the ocean, specifically the Hadal trenches below 6,000 meters, could support vertebrate life at all. The conditions at 8,300 meters, where the snailfish was filmed in the Mariana Trench, include pressure exceeding 830 atmospheres, meaning every square centimeter of the fish's body is bearing more than 830 kilograms of force at all times. A rigid structure under those conditions doesn't bend, it fails. The snailfish doesn't have a rigid structure. The skeletal cartilage, the absence of scales, the gelatinous tissue composition, these aren't deficiencies or signs of a poorly developed organism. They're precise adaptations for an environment where conventional fish anatomy would be crushed. The snailfish's cells also contain elevated concentrations of trimethylamine oxide, a compound that stabilizes proteins under pressure and prevents the kind of molecular deformation that would otherwise make cellular function impossible at that depth. It maintains the chemistry of its own biology in conditions that destroy most biology. The footage of snailfish at depth showed something unexpected beyond the animal's existence. They were active, moving, feeding, competing for food around bait, not torpid or sluggish, but functioning normally in what was supposed to be an incompatible environment. The snailfish didn't just survive the Hadal zone. It appears to occupy it as a functional apex predator at that depth, feeding on the small crustaceans and amphipods that make up the trench's invertebrate population. The impossibility of life at that depth turned out to be an assumption. The snailfish didn't know about the assumption. The last creature on this descent has no mouth and no stomach. It was discovered in 2002 on the bones of a whale carcass at the bottom of the ocean, anchored to the skeleton by root-like structures that disappeared directly into the bone. Nothing about its external anatomy explained what it was doing or how it was feeding. What researchers eventually worked out is that its feeding mechanism depends on something living inside it that has never evolved anywhere else. And without that partnership functioning correctly, the worm cannot feed at all. The Hadal zone has almost no consistent food supply. Whalefalls are among the largest and most significant food events that reach the trench floor. A single whale carcass, descending through thousands of meters of water before settling on the sediment, represents a mass of organic material that dwarfs anything else that arrives at this depth. Researchers have identified whalefalls as distinct ecological stages: a mobile scavenger stage where large animals strip the soft tissue, a subsequent enrichment stage where smaller organisms colonize the remaining material, and a final sulfurphilic stage where the skeleton itself becomes the food source. That last stage is the longest. Bones are dense, mineral-rich, and resistant to the kind of biological breakdown that processes soft tissue. Most animals can't access the nutrients locked inside bone without a digestive system capable of handling the mineral matrix, and at Hadal depths, the animals that can do that reliably are specialized to a degree that has no parallel in shallower environments. The polychaete worm, known commonly as the zombie worm, genus Osedax, was first discovered in 2002 during an expedition to Monterey Canyon, where researchers sent a remotely operated vehicle down to examine a whale carcass on the seafloor. What they found on the bones was something that had never been formally described: dense clusters of small worms, each one anchored to the bone surface by root-like structures that disappeared directly into the skeletal material. The feeding mechanism, if it could be called that, was entirely embedded in the bone. Nothing about the worm's external anatomy explained how it was eating. But the feeding system produces a dependency that isn't immediately obvious. The zombie worm doesn't break down bone through any mechanism its own biology generates alone. It relies on a biological partnership embedded inside its own tissue, symbiotic bacteria living within the root structures, without which the breakdown process cannot occur. The worm doesn't just feed through an unusual mechanism. It feeds through a mechanism that requires another organism functioning correctly inside it at all times. Remove that partnership, and the worm starves regardless of how much bone surrounds it. That dependency is precise enough that different species of zombie worm carry different bacterial strains, each matched to the specific composition of the host carcass the worm colonizes. But the colonization mechanism raises a timing problem that hasn't been fully resolved. A whale carcass sinks to the hadal floor after weeks of descent through the water column. By the time it reaches the sediment, mobile scavengers have already found it and begun stripping soft tissue. The zombie worm arrives later, once the skeleton is exposed. But the zombie worm is a poor swimmer with no obvious long-distance locomotion. How it locates a whale fall on the seafloor across distances that can span kilometers through total darkness in an environment with almost no directional current at the trench floor is not currently understood. The worm clearly gets there, and gets there in numbers, but the mechanism of arrival is an open question. But the decade-long skeleton occupation creates a consequence at the ecosystem level that only becomes clear at scale, while the zombie worm is processing a single whale skeleton over 50 to 100 years. The hadal zone around it is supported by that slow nutrient release, bacteria, crustaceans, and other worms building an active community around a single food source. When the skeleton is finally exhausted, that community collapses. The next whale fall may land kilometers away or not arrive for decades. The communities that form around whale falls at hadal depths are islands, temporary, isolated, entirely dependent on events that happen at the surface of an ocean that is 8,000 meters above them. No mouth, no stomach, and no conventional digestive system. And yet, the polychaete worm feeds continuously, occupies a food source for decades, and appears to be one of the more successful organisms in the hadal zone. The solution it arrived at bypasses the entire intake and processing apparatus that almost every other animal on the planet depends on. The root structures, called rhizomes, penetrate bone tissue and secrete a sulfuric acid compound that breaks down the mineral matrix of the bone from the inside. The collagen and lipids released by that breakdown are absorbed directly through the skin of the rhizomes and the main body of the worm. The worm doesn't consume the bone so much as it dissolves it and absorbs the result. At a whale fall, the term for a whale carcass that has sunk to the deep sea floor, zombie worms can be present in densities of thousands of individuals per square meter of skeleton. A single large whale skeleton can sustain a zombie worm community for 50 to 100 years before the bone is completely processed. What this means ecologically is that whale falls are not endpoints. They're ecosystems. The zombie worm is the organism that converts a skeleton into available nutrients over a decade-long timescale, and in doing so, creates conditions that support hundreds of other species, bacteria, crustaceans, other worms that couldn't otherwise survive at that depth. Remove the zombie worm from that sequence, and the whale skeleton sits intact on the ocean floor, inaccessible to everything around it. The nutrient cycle that feeds the Hadal zone's invertebrate population depends, at that stage, entirely on a worm with no mouth. Like the video if it kept you company. Subscribe if you want more of this. The ocean is mostly unexplored, which means there's no shortage of material.